Thank you very much. It's very good to be back here at Aspen. As U.S. Managing Editor of the Financial Times, I also want to thank Aspen for allowing us to be the media partner this year. It's a big deal for us at the Financial Times. As I said, I was at Aspen 6 months ago. I have to say, I prefer the mountain view, I think, in Colorado to the Southwest waterfront. I don't see any mountains, but in any case, I want to set up this discussion by talking a bit about, much like the Asia discussion that's come earlier this morning, how much the Ukraine crisis has affected other parts of the national security debate, and specifically the issue of economic security. And I think it's something that I, as a journalist, you think this one's better? 1, 2, 3? Much better. I was wondering why no one was laughing at my jokes. Maybe they just weren't very good. I want to set this up by talking a bit about, much like the conversation earlier this morning on Asia, the extent to which the Ukraine war has impacted other elements of national security policy, in this case, economic security. Because I think economic security was always something that those of us at the Financial Times would talk about quite frequently, but was never top of the agenda. But what was very apparent is that for those countries who are not actually Ukraine, but they're allies and neighbors of Ukraine, the issue of economic security has risen very high on the agenda, mostly in the area of energy security. But I would also argue the panel here is also going to talk about something that is almost equally important, which is economic security that is related to our domestic economies. What do I mean by this? I think if anyone has read, for instance, Robert Reich, who's I found very influential on labor markets, he has argued that the only assets a sovereign nation has in its economy are, 1, its labor force, and 2, its infrastructure. And we have here on our stage 2 experts in both of those areas, and who are working very hard about increasing the skill set in America and the security of America and our economy. So that is the way I want to frame this discussion. And Zoë, I want to start with you on this one, because one of the things you're working on at the Commerce Department is exactly this, which is trying to find a way for the government to incentivize our education institutions, our corporates, to better skill set our labor force for what is an increasing competition with other, frankly, rival nations in the area of technology, in the area of STEM. Let me ask you just first off, what actually is the role of the government? Because unlike perhaps some of our European allies, there is not a long tradition of the government getting very involved in skill setting, particularly the federal government, in the education system. What do you think the role is for the federal government in particular, but perhaps even state and regional governments, about setting targets for skill setting our labor force, ensuring that companies have people they can hire who have the skills they need to compete?
Well, let me start by saying that people in the Aspen Strategy Group who've been around these conversations for a long time will know that I've been talking about the importance of economic security to national security for a couple of decades, and generally people have kind of rolled their eyes. So I am just feeling great that the conversation starts with, we all understand the importance of economic security to our national security. So, and I say that because we have so often segmented policy decisions so that they're in silos and we don't necessarily operate against the intersections between them. And the fact that this group is now focused on that intersection is enormously important. So we now need to focus on another intersection which has also been siloed, and that is the development of our workforce and the skills of our people. It is really imperative to our leadership in technology, and technology will drive our leadership in economic growth and national security. It's really imperative to our leadership in technology that we develop the capacity to have the skilled workers we need across the whole value chain. And as you noted, this is a global challenge. The Chinese have this challenge, the Europeans have this challenge, every part of the world has the same challenge. Well, we've just confronted an enormous disruption from COVID and the acceleration of change that has come with that, the acceleration of automation and the disruption to the jobs that people have had. And so our challenge now, I think our challenge as a government, our challenge as a country, is to capitalize on that disruption and come out of it with a stronger system of training our workers and moving people into jobs that will give them real careers in the future and rebuild the middle class by having people have the opportunity to be in middle-income jobs that have growth potential. The administration's been very clear about its economic objective. It's to create the talent, the technology, the manufacturing base that we need to really lead in this century. And we've just achieved with Congress over $1 trillion in investment in America between the CHIPS and Science Act, the Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Adjustment Act. Fortunately, those statutes have in them training funding. So that's one place where we can start, and in collaboration with business and educators and others, really try to create the robust training system that we need. You know, 100 years ago, or over 100 years ago, when we moved from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, we actually invented the high school in order to create the level set of training and education people needed to make that transition. And now, with our ability to work with all sectors together and trying to figure this out, we need to invent the lifelong training system that we need in a world of enormous and rapid change. And I'll leave it there and come back to some of the specific things we've done.
Let me just follow up before I go to Kent, because you mentioned the word that I think rings a lot of people's ears, which is China. And you mentioned that China has the same challenge, but I guess to what extent, how do I put this? I mean, you rightfully said that you have for 10 years been working on this issue and there hasn't been a lot of people listening. The threat that China poses for technology leadership seems to be something that is galvanized like no other thing can galvanize bipartisanship in Washington, this kind of issue. To what extent is what you're trying to do driven by the Chinese threat, or maybe this is not an and/or, to what extent is actually China a helpful thing, I know it sounds slightly weird, in galvanizing the national security establishment and the federal government to start thinking about this more seriously?
Well, that's a very big question, and there's some other people in this room who are probably more expert on U.S.-China relations than I am. But I would say that this is a global challenge, and it has galvanized us to appreciate that we can use, if we do this right, we can use the levers of our democracies and our ability for all sectors to work together to do this better than others. And the battle for the future is going to turn on whether or not we create the skilled workforces we need to deploy and invent and build off the capacity that technology provides. So just this week, the US and Europe have decided to collaborate on this together. And at the US-EU Trade and Technology Council meeting, we announced the creation of a Talent for Growth task force, which will be a task force made up not just of government officials, but people from the private sector, business, labor, educators. And the objective of the task force is to draw on what we each have to contribute that's best and to build out a really vibrant capacity to collaborate to grow the skills of our collective workforces. And this should make us even stronger in the global environment.
Ken, I want to talk to you about sort of the second bit of this conversation, which is sort of the physical infrastructure, the security of the physical infrastructure. But if I could just continue this conversation with you on workforce skilling, because I'm just curious if you could sort of tackle the issue of what role the private sector should play in this, because Zoe and I were talking about this before we came on stage. In the early stages of the Cold War, where we saw the threat from the Soviet Union, The big American corporates, GE, IBM, some of these brand names, even Kodak, which at the time was a tech company, saw that they played a very important role in training their employees up that value chain into more STEM, what was then not called STEM, but these sort of STEM areas. Google, Alphabet has been very active in some of this, but I guess talk to me a bit what that balance is. Where is the corporate role and the corporate responsibility in trying to skill up our workforce in that regard?
Yeah, we're very supportive of the work that Zoe, the Commerce Department, the Secretary are doing here. I think the first thing to say is that every country around the world, as we go into this digital century, needs to have a digital strategy to provide and to protect. To provide by creating the engine, the innovation that's raising living standards and pushing forward, and to protect on the security side and come to both of those. On the provide side of the house, there absolutely is an important role for the private sector, which can invest. We've invested in the notion of training. We're coming up on 10 million Americans and millions of people more around the world on digital skills, so they have an on-ramp onto that information superhighway that Al Gore used to talk about. That is soup to nuts, from being able to operate your own website if you're a small business to becoming a cybersecurity professional and expanding the number of people that come into doing some of the most advanced work we have. At Google, we have something like 15,000 computer who PhDs who are doing work at Google and going on to do work beyond Google in ways that really lifts up our ability to innovate for the next generation of artificial intelligence, quantum, and even beyond. But not all of those jobs need to be computer science PhDs. We have a range of different things that we need throughout our economy to be successful. Some of that is through training and skilling. Some of that is making sure we have a diverse workforce, working with a variety of different colleges and universities so that there's an on-ramp for digital skills, computer science training and the like. And some of it is on the immigration side. And we are encouraged that there seems to be movement in the U.S. toward passage of the Bipartisan EAGLE Act, which will allow the U.S. to draw on some of the most talented people from around the world, as we have over the prior decades. So there's an awful lot to be done here, and that's just on this side of the house. I can also turn to infrastructure, if that makes sense, because the complementary piece to this is not just making sure we have the right people, but we also have to have the right structures around it. Some of that is physical infrastructure, and the U.S. has made steps, and countries around the world have made steps to progress our work on a variety of semiconductors and chips, and that's very important. And I think we fell a little bit behind, and we had a wake-up call over the course of the last couple of years about the importance of that, excuse the pun, substrate of digital innovation. But it doesn't begin and end with chips. You have to have the factories, you have to have the people that work in the factories, and you have to have the people who can innovate on top of the work that's going out. We tend to, in the chips context, we get pulled into a conversation about how many nanometers is the chip and how it advances. But we're seeing more and more advanced specialization and cutting-edge work going on here. It's extraordinarily important. The work of an interdependent digital economy is a matter of chips, but also a matter of software and infrastructure. That's why today we actually just announced and published our first volume of security perspectives on securing the software supply chain, not just the hardware supply chain. Through open source and other efforts, we're investing $10 billion over the next few years in making sure that our software environment, in which many of us increasingly live and work, is as robust as our physical security environment. And coming back to your earlier point about Ukraine, the Ukraine war was not only a humanitarian tragedy, it's a military war and, of course, an economic war, but it's also a cyber war and an information war. And on those fronts, again, we need to work together. It's increasingly clear that security is no longer a one-off series of individual proprietary fixes. Cybersecurity is a team sport. It not only can be, but it has to be both open and collaborative. Building not just walls, but bridges as we work together, building security into products. So we no longer talk about security products, we talk about secure products, secure by default. And then making sure that the information environment is also safeguarded against misinformation, disinformation, malign foreign state actor attacks, as we've seen repeatedly out of Russia across a variety of different platforms. Collectively, working together, sharing threat intelligence information between companies and governments. We've taken dramatic steps and made significant strides, but an awful lot more work needs to be done.
Can I ask, both of you in your answers mentioned the CHIPS Act, which is, I think, very relevant because if you were going to have a growth in chip manufacturing in the U.S., we need people who can actually work in the plants. So the issue of training up labor is related to the building the infrastructure. But Ken, can I start with you? And this is maybe the factor of me having lived abroad for 10 years and just returning to my home country. I guess I am always struck about the debate around this because it used to not be the American thing that the federal government got involved in this stuff. Leave it to the private sector. Having lived in Europe for 10 years where the public sector gets much more involved, the French in particular, but not even the French. It feels to me, and I know this sounds slightly off the wall, a little bit un-American to hear both a corporate and a government official talking about direct role of the federal government in setting these kinds of goals for both manufacturing and for training. Am I missing something here? Has actually just the debate changed because of the threat environment and the environment that we're now facing globally?
Well, I would take a little bit of issue, Peter, with the premise, because I think the American government has always had a role in promoting the advance of basic research and science. Google's origin story comes in part out of DARPA and investments that were made in the early development of the internet. Now, I think we have come away from that vision. In roughly 1964, the American government spent something like 2.5% of GDP on R&D. And today, in the last few years, that number is down to well less than 1%. So coming back to that notion of investing for the future in a collaborative way, taking advantage of the great academic research institutes and the great private sector research that's being done, but also having the government with a long-term stake in innovation, I think has long been a part of the American story.
So let me ask you the same question, because obviously Commerce Department is a lot what is driving this. And maybe ask you to talk a little bit about what the spectrum looks like, for lack of a better word. Because I think what Ken's getting at, certainly with the DARPA example, is there was a role for the government, and always has been, on sort of core national security things. And I remember talking to the Secretary of the Navy recently and says, look, if we're going to end up fighting a war in the South China Sea, I need to know that my destroyer doesn't have a ball bearing that's manufactured in China. So there's very core national security things that clearly the government needs to get involved in the private sector to ensure supply chain security and stuff like that. The CHIPS Act moves that slightly from pure national security to more to economic security. We think this is an important sector to have domestically because of the threat to Taiwan and stuff like that. How much further do we go? And I guess, is that just one of these, we know it when we see it? Because again, it is striking to me, the debate, and this is bipartisan now, that we actually do think the federal government should be playing a role in deciding where we should be investing in manufacturing and supply chains. Is CHIPS a beginning, or do you think CHIPS is kind of the be-all and end-all right now?
I think that this administration has been very clear that it needs to collaborate with business, labor, educators, others, to draw on the strengths of America and to play the role that the government needs to play to enable the great strengths of the private sector to succeed and to lead globally. And so that's, where we've been going. The president, as I said, has been very clear that there is a very important role for the federal government in enabling this country to grow and succeed in its talent, its technology, its manufacturing base, and of course to ensure that our national security, which is so closely tied to our private sector and economic activity, is maintained. And I do think that we will be looking at whether there are other critical technologies where this is important too, but what we has been an extraordinary collaboration with Congress to confront America's future and to build America's future. And we have now a lot of work to do to implement that and to make that effective for the American people.
Can I ask you the flip side of the question I asked Kent, which is, as you look at the need for a upskilled labor force, the role that corporates should be playing in this? Because, again, we were talking before we got on stage, this used to be a role that if you worked at a company your entire life, companies like GE would come to you and train you up. You talked about AT&T off stage, which I didn't mean to steal your thunder there, but AT&T had, when they felt they had we didn't need people up on phone poles anymore, retraining them to other skills. I'm curious what role you would like to see the private sector, if you think they're doing enough right now, and if there is a way for the federal government to either incentivize, or is it more a bully pulpit kind of thing to get American corporates to be more active in this area?
An enormously important part of developing the skills that workers need to have for this economy is going to be training while people are working. So we've been trying to build up the number of people who are in registered apprenticeships, not just apprenticeships in construction, which are enormously important, and the labor unions know how to do this well, where people are paid well and they keep moving up from one job to another based on the training that they get through the apprenticeships. But we just did, the administration just did with the private sector, a cybersecurity sprint to get more cybersecurity workers trained as registered apprentices so that the workers get the apprenticeship certificate, which makes it clear for employers what kind of talent and training they have, but they're paid while they get trained because they're working on one level of work, but they can get trained up into the next level of work through the apprenticeship. So work and learn models like registered apprenticeships are going to be a very important part of this. These will be undoubtedly part of the implementation of the CHIPS Act. The work that will be done will be in some ways partnership between the government and the companies and the labor unions. And so this is what I meant when I was talking about the need to really invent the system of lifelong learning, because if we know one thing for sure, we know that change is going to be only faster and a constant. And so we need to figure out how we're going to not just train people up right now to work in semiconductor fabs, but to create a system where people are constantly changing their skill sets. And one of the things that interests me are with the layoffs in some of the companies like Kent's, and I don't know whether you guys have done layoffs, but in that sector, can we move people into some of the other technology areas where we need workers, like in semiconductor fabs, by modest sort of bridge training that takes them from what they know to the new jobs that we need filled?
Kent, do you want to jump in here?
Just a quick anecdote to illustrate the importance of Zoe's points about apprenticeship models generally. And I think we have a lot to learn from countries around the world like Germany, which have experimented this, worked with this for many years. My most popular tweet ever was when we announced that we would take career certificates in lieu of college degrees for applications at Google. And over 100 companies joined into that program. And I think it's easy to forget that 2/3 of Americans have never attended college. So creating alternative skilling avenues for people to come in, and with the promise or the likelihood of being able to get a job if you successfully complete those programs, is a very promising new avenue, and one we're very excited about.
Ken, I'm getting the warning here, but I want to just touch on one more topic before we leave the stage, which is cybersecurity, which is something I know Google Alphabet works very, quite a bit on. Let me just, in some ways in the Ukraine war, this is the dog that hasn't barked yet. We kept waiting for a horribleness to happen, and it hasn't. I'm just curious, if you were to look particularly non-governmental, private sector, is that because we're actually just getting better at cybersecurity? If I just say to you up front, how nervous are you about the security of our private sector networks? What would be your answer to that?
I think we should all be vigilant and concerned and working hard, but I think we are making progress. We've been on a journey for many years, ever since Operation Aurora, when our services were attacked out of mainland China, coming on a dozen years ago, which was a real wake-up call for us and led us to reinvent the way we approach cybersecurity, building in the notion of zero trust networks, multi-factor authentication, webs of trust, etc. There are a lot of outdated, vulnerable, proprietary services out there. The older your system, the longer it's been since it's been patched. The more full of holes it is, the more vulnerable you are, and the more vulnerable your entire supply chain is. So we have to think about this holistically. Sophisticated cyber attacks are hard. I think there was a notion earlier in the war that it was a grab and go kind of thing. To plan and execute these things requires significant discipline and structure. But we are by no means out of the woods, and we see every day lots of different vulnerabilities out there. Our threat assessment group which together with Mandiant does some of our core threat intel, tracks 270 different malign actors out there who are looking to find vulnerabilities in systems of all varieties, from government to essential infrastructure to private sector companies. So it is a big and growing problem. People are on it, and we're making significant progress, but it's way too early to take it for granted.
Last little question before I get the hook. I know that you work quite a bit with technologists in Ukraine as well on this same issue. Again, sort of same question there. Why do you think it's been the dog that hasn't barked yet? Why is it that we haven't seen Russia successfully target? I mean, having used Kinetic quite successfully on the electrical infrastructure, wasn't so successful on infrastructure attacks in Ukraine.
The Ukraine government has been quite savvy in being forward-looking. They were digitally first. The deputy prime minister is also the digital minister. And so they were able to use the cloud in a hybrid way, move a lot of their IT experts out of country so that they could actually be outside of the zone of some of these attacks. They upgraded their infrastructure to a modern hybrid architecture in many ways. We work with them on this and other areas. They employed things like air raid alert services. So Android phones throughout Ukraine could get earlier alerts of incoming Russian attacks. So they have been very sophisticated on their infrastructure side as well as their anti-disinformation. And we've been very proud to partner with them. In fact, we were the first company to receive the Special Peace Prize of the Ukrainian government, recognizing some of the work we've been able to do together on these fronts.
And one of the interesting stories we followed is the Ukrainians who used to work in Silicon Valley, who have gone back to Ukraine and have worked with their old friends back in California to help on some of these things. Anyway, thank you very much, Zoë, Ken. I'm very glad that economic security is back on the top of our agenda because the FT covers it very much. Please join me in thanking them.